Judah only costs 58.5k yen to max, which is extremely cheap for what he does. At full upgrade, he has a 100 degrees cone and is one of the best support slash DPS units within this game. He applies slow and bleed on hit, which is just amazing crowd control to have within your team. His passive, Waste Not, slows enemies by 30% and applies bleed for 20% of his own damage over 6 seconds. While attacking a debuffed enemy, he deals 50% more damage, and if a bleeding enemy dies within his range on a 10-second local cooldown, he spreads the bleed to nearby enemies for 30% of his own damage for 4 seconds. His second passive, Want Not, lets him build 1% meter every time he inflicts a debuff. This debuff is either the slow or the bleed. At 100% meter, he activates a nuke that applies burn and bleed for 100% of his damage over 8 seconds. And he applies a new debuff called Deceased. What Deceased does, it makes enemies take 50% more damage from DOTs. So what you can do is you can stack this with Sukuna's Cleave, which is a 20% bleed amp to make a 70% bleed buffer. He usually builds meter every 4 hits using a solid spirit, which is realistic in most game modes. In that case, his DPS sits at 71k. Already amazing for how cheap he is. If meter builds every 3 hits, his DPS jumps to 85k. Theoretical numbers like 103k or 156k DPS, which is a meter hit of 2 or 1, are possible only in infinite and super dense wave modes. So you can see this within infinite, as you said, or tournaments with a high enemy density. With that said, Judah has a few key weaknesses that you should look out for. He heavily relies on Monarch. To stay relevant, I mean in the top tiers, since he's a 2 placement and he loses major value with his extra placement. Because if you don't know, if the first Judah applies a debuff and that second Judah tries to apply the same debuff, he won't gain any meter, because the slow from the first Judah won't stack with the slow from the second Judah. So this heavily affects him, negatively of course, because it means he can't pair up with other units like Baiken or Goku, who's slow as well, because both slow and they affect it heavily because he can't stack their slow, meaning he won't gain meter, which in theory will affect his nuke damage a lot. He won't nuke that often. And also, one thing to look out for, if he kills an enemy instantly, he won't really gain meter as well. One more thing he lacks is that he doesn't have debuff and status immunity, which makes him less convenient in some content. Overall, Judah is one of the best value supports in the game with proper setup and use. He brings insane utility, great crowd control and strong DOT based damage for a low price. And right now he's one of the only DOT buffers for each DOT. So that is Judah. Enjoy.